Welcome, everyone. If you don't know, you're about to be in for a treat. I am Stacey Toth. I was with Beauty Counter for almost a decade, nine years, I think. And one of my favorite humans in all of that time was getting to work with Lindsay Dahl, who is just an incredible wealth of knowledge of all things non-toxic living, and was Beauty Counter's prior head of mission and board member. Her approach is very science-based and logical and not fear-based, which I really appreciate. And I think it's important when we're talking with our clients to have a very similar approach. So I'm so excited for you to learn from her today. She's an activist, a writer, and clean living expert, and her work has helped pass over 20 health protective laws become enacted over her 20-year career, which is incredible. One of my favorite facts about Lindsay is that she helped with the getting lead out of children's toys. And my children were very young at the time that Thomas the Tank Engine was found had lead in the paint, which is something that you were associated with long before I even knew about it. And I think that's so cool and something that those of us who have teenagers are familiar with at this point. So it's been a long career of making change. And since 2004, she has worked at the forefront of environmental health campaigns, working to eliminate toxic chemicals in consumer products through policy and market shifts. And Lindsay has since moved on to become the Chief Impact Officer at Ritual, a supplement brand. And that is not by coincidence. Her intention is to take on this shady industry too. And I'm excited for her to share all of the wisdom I know we all want to soak up. Lindsay, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. What have you been up to, by the way, before we jump into all the hard-hitting questions?
Oh my gosh. What period of time are we talking about here, Stacey? What have I been up to like the last month or so?
No, the last couple of years. How have you been?
I've been doing really well. Thank you for having me. It's so fun to see so many faces and names that I know and love and have long relationships with many of you on the call. So yeah, the last 2+ years, I have transitioned into the supplement industry, and that is by design. If you think about using the reference of Thomas the Tank Engine from early in my career, I have been kind of tackling different consumer product categories. And so when I first started, I was really focused on children's toys because that was the first kind of galvanizing topic that a lot of environmental health leaders were using to help bring the public's consciousness, kind of like increase the public's consciousness to mirror where the peer-reviewed science was. I then moved on to household cleaners and kind of more industrial applications when I was working in DC. Then worked obviously with Beauty Counter for over 8 years in the beauty and personal care sector. And so I naturally am someone that once it feels like an industry is starting to kind of be on its way, I want to go into the next one. And supplements was always at the top of my list. And so I've been kind of like soaking up and understanding both what's good, what's bad, and also where is there just a lot of misinformation in the supplements industry? Because I think there's a lot of misinformation, perhaps even more so than beauty and personal care. And sussing through what's fact from fiction to help consumers, lawmakers, and brands understand what we can do to make products safer and more efficacious when it comes to products that we're ingesting and putting into our bodies. So that's the high level, just like trajectory of like how I even got into working in the supplement space. But really excited to kind of like dive into many things that I've learned.
Before I start asking questions, I want to acknowledge that, Lindsay, you have drawn such a crowd that we have maxed the Zoom. So if you have people that are reaching out to you, just let them know it is being recorded and we will share it with the team. And apologies for my underestimation of everyone's enthusiasm. So I would love if maybe we could just start with what drew you to educate about those supplements. I know you just talked about, it's an area that needs to be updated, but what exactly does that mean, really?
Yep. So I'll tell a little story of how I found Ritual because it's kind of the story of how I really started to care about this space. I was invited to be a guest speaker at the Ritual showroom. We're mostly a D2C, and now we're in Amazon, Target, and Whole Foods. But at the time, they had a showroom on Melrose, and I was invited to speak. I was working for Beauty Counter, And I walked into the showroom and they had all of the ingredients in the multivitamin and the prenatal, the actual ingredients themselves laid out, and it had the supplier name, like the actual name of who they source from and where the final place of manufacturing was. And at the time, I was postpartum and I had been using Ritual because my doula gave it to me like randomly. I was like, okay, whatever, you know. So it was like kind of like these random things that like no one really knew about Ritual at the time. The reason I kind of had this aha moment is like a lot of people, I have never been a big supplement taker. I still am not. That's okay. A lot of people are. So first and foremost is that a lot of people, 95% of Americans are taking at least one supplement a day. And I like to work on issues that I feel like a lot of people will be impacted by. Number two, I had the personal lens of having just had a baby myself and understanding how, oh, wait, if there's one time in my life I'm going to be diligent about taking supplements, it's when I'm pregnant. So taking a prenatal. And then third was this aha moment of speaking at a Ritual event and seeing a level of transparency that I, and someone who was working at the beauty industry, was like, oh shit, this is cool. Like, I don't know a single brand across any consumer category that is sharing the suppliers publicly on the website. That's really cool. And so it was kind of like, fast forward, it took me 3 years to eventually make the move. And I didn't know this, but at the time the CEO was courting me that whole time. And I just felt like, you know what, there's a huge opportunity here, given how many people in the United States and North America in particular are consuming supplements. And I also knew that as someone in the beauty space that was really focused on not everything that's natural is better, I in particularly knew that was true for the case of supplements. And I knew a bunch of my friends and family members and everyone I talked to were really focused on plant-based supplements. We can get into the nuances of that. But I also knew that heavy metals were contaminating both people and plant-based natural supplements at a higher rate. And so like I felt like another opportunity for me to be able to step into this space and say, here's what the science says, here's how sourcing is practiced, and here's how we can find a path forward, knowing that nothing's ever going to be heavy metal free.
I definitely want to talk about the synthetics and natural and all of that kind of stuff, but just kind of taking it back to basic education.
Yep.
A lot of consumers would assume that testing is being done, whether it's for heavy metals or, pesticide levels because of the concentrations of supplements. How are they regulated? What is actually being tested in terms of FDA requirements or not?
Yep. Good question. So the last time there was a major update to supplement laws was in 1994, which feels like it wasn't that long ago, but it's over 30 years. And the market has grown exponentially since then. So wrap your head around this. 1994, new laws get passed in the United States in particular. At the time, there's 4,000 supplement products on the market, 4,000. In 30 years, that number is now over 9,500. So there's been an almost 2,700% jump in the volume of different supplement products on the market without any sort of updates to, at least here in the United States, federal laws. And the reason that's a problem is because the existing laws that do exist, which we can kind of talk about how supplements are and are not regulated, things like requiring safety testing or limits for heavy metals across supplements and protein powders do not currently exist. So you've got known issues around contamination, but you don't have any sort of requirements or kind of proof points. It's kind of leave it up to companies to do this work, and we're going to trust them unless something is tested and there's a product issue, and then we can talk about potentially doing some like retroactive work from the federal government. So the long and the short of it is that we've got a safety and efficacy problem. And the two questions that most consumers are asking when they're shopping the supplements aisle is this safe for me and is it going to work? And so our federal system right now is really mostly focused on what are called structure function claims. So how can a brand actually make a claim about this particular ingredient, vitamin D levels, and impacts to X, Y, or Z related to your health? That's where the majority of a lot of the federal framework and requirements are focused. And that's a good thing because a lot of other industries, including the beauty industry, do not have similar kind of oversight and scrutiny around the claims. So I'm glad that does exist. So if anyone says the supplements industry is not regulated, that is not an accurate statement. Please don't repeat that. Is it under-regulated? Yes, we've got some work to do when it comes to making sure that products are not only efficacious and brands are doing the work to make sure they are efficacious, but also that common safety and contaminant issues are also addressed.
So when there is a contamination in the States, the FDA puts out a notice and says, I subscribe to these notices, and sometimes I'm shocked as to some of the contamination that can come to these supplements. Do they have the ability to mandate a recall, or how does that look? And then also, what does it look like in Canada for those people who are not in the States?
I should have done research on Canada. I didn't. I'm sorry to all my Canadian friends. Not my area of expertise, but I will look it up because I should know this anyway. So we can do a part two. How's that sound?
Sorry, I previewed questions for you, but that one was in the chat and it didn't occur to me to ask you ahead of
Yeah,
time.
no,
My
I should have.
apologies.
I should have. I should have thought about that too. Um, so do you want me to break down the safety issues high level before we get into the regulatory stuff, or
However you want to
okay?
navigate that.
I think I'm going to start with high level because it's helpful, especially for those of you that are newer to the industry, to like start high level and then kind of like think about how you talk about this. So there's three different kind of buckets that I would put safety concerns for the supplement industry. Since many of you are coming from the beauty and personal care side, I'm going to draw a lot of comparisons there. The first thing to know is that for ingredients used in supplements, there are significantly less hazardous ingredients used as intentionally used ingredients in supplements than in beauty and personal care. That's good news, right? We like that. There are still safety concerns when it comes to contaminants like heavy metals. So that's the first bucket is heavy metals are one of the kind of top, and pesticides are the top concerns, especially for supplements that have botanicals or naturally derived ingredients, because heavy metals come from the environment and the Earth's crust. So a study from 2009 found, and it was a very large sample size, it was over 6,000 people that were studied. Herbal and botanical supplement users had on average 10% increased levels of lead in their bodies than the non-herbal botanical supplement users. So that's one of many studies that has happened in addition to product testing that has shown that a lot of these products do contain heavy metals at various different kind of levels. The second issue is around planetary health. So if you think about, I am not vegan, but there are a lot of animal-derived ingredients that can have very real impacts. I'll probably make some people cringe or feel unpopular on the call. I wouldn't be myself if I wasn't doing that, though. So things like bovine-derived collagen, I used to consume it for years, have really well documented and known environmental harms associated with that, as well as things like certain types of fish oils, et cetera. There are vegan versions of those different products. But for those who care about the intersection between planetary safety, supplements do have an opportunity to start to kind of invest and change some of those practices or source from alternate ingredients. The third bucket for safety is safety of workers, which many of you know I'm really passionate about. And why at Ritual, at least, traceability is really important. The more you know about your supply chain, the more you know about how people are treated within your supply chain. Similar to a lot of industries, supply chains are super complicated. And a lot of these are globally sourced ingredients that have lots of different people, including workers in fields, factories, et cetera, that may or may not be treated well. So brands need to make sure that they know their supply chain so they can also make sure that people are safe. So that's the kind of like framing of like safety when it comes to contaminants. Less so. There's just a few examples we can talk about of like actually active ingredients, planetary health, and then the safety of people is the like way that I have been framing and talking about safety issues within the supplements industry.
I think a lot of
Pause.
people would be curious to hear more about a couple of the things that you mentioned. So the idea that plant-based things could have more heavy metals, and a lot of the questions that I've actually been getting as we look at alternative brands are, oh, there's a colorant in this makeup, or there is, I don't know, a variety of questions. You mentioned collagen, right? The difference between grass-fed, free range, bovine collagen is entirely different from like feedlot low quality collagen and all those things. And I
Yep.
think for a lot of us, as we're looking at some of these, how do we start to parse apart the labels and the claims and the wording and all the things that we've come to know about the greenwashing on the beauty side? um, we know that Beauty Counter used colorants in our makeup, for example,
Hmm.
right? But it was a different kind of colorant. So how do we, as we're navigating new brands, start to parse apart some of those things?
Yep. Good question. Um, so know that the supplement industry is 10 to 15 years behind beauty and be okay with that. So anytime you ask a brand a question, whether you're going to work for that brand or if you want to consume their products, asking the question in a friendly way to their customer service teams helps people like myself. Anytime we get, I'm like, oh, great, we got another question about that. I'm like, see, look, people care about this stuff. Like know that your questions drive internal discussion and they help drive impact. So please ask questions. The second is I think there's almost better certifications in the supplement space than in some other categories. So for example, I really like Clean Label Project as the kind of independent certification that tests for bisphenols, phthalates, a suite of over 200 pesticides and heavy metals against Prop 65 standards. And so that's a Clean Label Project's great for like protein powders and supplements to know that someone else has done the contaminant testing. There are limitations, like they haven't gotten yet into PFAS testing. I don't even know, like no one's figured out how to do PFAS testing within the supplement space in general. So like they're going to continue to evolve as a certification, but I think they're a good certification when it comes to safety. If you are looking for something that is a lot of plant-based products, non-GMO is specific, obviously, to non-GMO, but is still a good certification that has a lot of credibility in the space. And I think the question around like, where's this collagen being sourced from? Like asking really specific questions. So I think the level of specificity you receive back from the customer care team is also going to be very telling. So this holds true for any sort of industry. If you get a thank you so much for looking into it, still know that your work is like you've had an impact by sending that email. If a brand gives you a pretty detailed response and says things that they don't have answers to, that's always my favorite. Because if anything feels like it's too perfectly wrapped up in a little bit of a legal bow, I'm like, okay, what are you not telling me? Like that's usually a red flag for me. And if a brand is like, we don't have all the answers, but here are things we're proud of and we're working on, then they pat themselves on the back. I think that's great. I'm getting a little off tangent. I can go and I can also like recap some of the certifications, but just to share a few more. Informed sport, informed choice are really used for a lot of athletes, but they also do a lot of contaminant testing, including heavy metals, and different kind of banned and controlled substances, another good certification. And then two other good certifications to look for are NSF and USP. So NSF and USP are kind of similar. They do some safety contaminant testing, but what they mostly look at is what is on the label for the supplemental effects panel. Is it actually in the product? And at the doses that the brand says it is. There's a natural degradation of different levels. Again, I'm going to use vitamin D as an example. Naturally, over the shelf life, those vitamin D levels degrade, which is normal, and supplement companies have to plan for that when they're designing their products. But there's been a lot of problems within the industry of not actually having what they say is on the label at the level within the product. And that's a problem for consumers. And so when you look for and you see USP or NSF, you can have a better assurance that someone is checking to make sure that the label claims are being met with what is actually in the product. I'm seeing,
I was
I'm
writing
trying.
notes. Okay, so what I didn't hear you talk about other than Clean Label Project was the safety and contamination testing. So I know you talked earlier about safety and the kind of those bigger three pictures. When we're kind of thinking about some of the contaminants, so you mentioned pesticides and heavy metals as being big in supplements, as
Yep.
well as potentially BPA, especially in like a packaging perspective, I'm imagining, but not PFAS. Beyond these kind of certifications or labels, what kinds of questions can we ask brand, like if we are going to reach out to a brand and ask, okay, tell me about your safety and contamination, what are you checking? Like, what does that question look like in order to get the answers that we're desiring?
Yeah. Good question. It kind of depends on what products the brand is offering. So I'm gonna give you a bunch of questions that I feel like will span at least the products that I'm thinking about: multivitamins, single-use ingredients, protein powders, skin health, those types of things. So I would ask, first and foremost, what sort of safety program do you have? Do you have any sort of independent testing for common contaminants? If so, what can you share with me about that program? Number two, I would ask about efficacy. How do you design and create your supplements with efficacy in mind? And what role do human clinical trials play in that efficacy journey? We can talk more about efficacy in human clinicals in a minute. The third question, if it's not apparent from their website, is what certifications are you currently seeking or do you have for these products? There's no single certification that's going to hit all of the different things. I just saw the question of like, are these real or are these just greenwashing? It depends on what the certification is designed to fact check. Another question I would ask is, what can you tell me about your sustainability program? How are you approaching packaging, ingredient sourcing? Do you have a publicly available report, annual impact mission sustainability report that I can see your progress on these types of initiatives? Companies should, in this day and age, have an annual report. If they don't, also big red flag, please encourage them to do that. And then the fourth question I would ask is about transparency. So how transparent are you with customers, both about your ingredients, where they come from, how they're being sourced? And it's a generic question, but it's okay because, again, based on whatever that particular company sends you, you'll be able to like see what level of transparency feels okay. I do want to pause and talk about transparency because, again, it's a little different in the supplement space. And I even saw a question about like proprietary blends, so we can get into that as well.
Yeah, no, I think it would be a great place to get into that. And I think this also goes into the common question that we get about natural flavors, artificial flavors, spices, things that we've seen that I know there's like a California law about colorants and how that could be like a fragrance loophole. Are we thinking also that flavorings are also part of that loophole? And where does proprietary blends or a certain stop at the information that you're getting feel appropriate to what a brand would be willing to share, or where is it a red flag?
Yeah, good question. This one is gray. I'm okay with gray areas, but there's a few different ways I'm going to answer the question. The first of which is the ingredients used in natural flavors are significantly safer than those that are used in natural fragrances. So the reason why I've been a long-time advocate for full transparency around fragrances, regardless of the source, is that the fragrance industry has known problems for fragrance ingredients like phthalates, the long list of stuff that we already know, carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive toxicants. That's less of an issue for natural flavors. And there's two reasons for that. Number one, these products have always been designed to be ingested. And number two, just by nature, creating a perfume is a much more toxic endeavor than creating a flavor that you're using for whether it's you're making cookies at home or it's your protein powder. So again, the baseline is we're starting from a safer place. So you can't just take the assumptions you have learned from the beauty industry and apply it to the supplements category. Let's take the win. There's a lot of negative stuff to talk about. Let's take the win. The second thing is because there are less legit safety concerns, I've always still been of the mindset, and I've shared publicly, well, why not share? Like, what do you have to hide? If everything's safer, that's great, but you should still be transparent about it. I think that's still the right philosophy to have. The industry's not there yet because just now people and companies are getting questions about natural flavors. Again, it took a solid 10 plus years in the beauty industry to get the level of kind of transparency, public disclosure, and kind of normalization across brands around sharing fragrance ingredients. While there's still work to do in the beauty industry, we are at square one in the supplement industry. So no, it's going to take some time. I work for a brand, for example, Ritual in our protein powder. I have done a deep dive because I work for the company on the inside on the vanilla, particularly that vanilla blend. I still, every single day, am working with our suppliers around increased flavor transparency within the company that I work for. And it's an uphill battle, but even within the last 2 years, the conversations are changing. So like, again, the consumer pressure really helps people like myself internally, because sometimes companies can't always get all the answers, or if you get the answers, you can't publicly share it in the same way that Ritual would want to. I'm going to pause there because there's probably other questions about that, and that was a lot of information. Is there anything else that specific to that you want me to talk about, Stacy?
So to recap what I'm hearing you say, the synthetic options aren't necessarily bad, right? The same thing that we've said about Beautycounter for a long time. Just because something is natural doesn't mean it's safe. Just because something's synthetic doesn't mean that it's bad. And as we're looking at products that we either might want to consume or sell, we don't need to have the same sort of alarmist approach to natural flavors, but we can also push with brands to say, hey, it would be great if you're using citric acid and vanilla esters or whatever the case might be. Like, explain those out specifically so that if someone has an allergy, because really that's where I see the biggest risk with that, right? Is that if someone has an allergy to a particular spice or ingredient, that they can identify it in the label and not feel like, oh, what
Yep.
is in the natural flavors?
Yep.
Um, did I recap that?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great recap. And I do think allergies are important, and it's part of the reason that part of the specific ask of a company can be knowing that we're in this gray area, right? Can be, I understand if publicly you're not in a position with your suppliers to share the entire blend publicly with consumers. Do you as a company have access to and have you vetted that proprietary blend yourself? Because that's the specific question. A lot of brands are going to be like, no, we've taken their word for it, or they don't even share that with us. And that's a problem. So that's where I feel like there's a problem when even the brand itself, it's one thing if a brand has full access and has an NDA with that particular flavor house and they have on hand. So if you have a customer and you're like, I'm allergic to X, Y, or Z, the brand can say, I can confirm that it's not in that flavor blend. The majority of brands cannot do that. And so it is on brands to like push their suppliers and their flavor suppliers to at least have a little bit of visibility so they can do the due diligence themselves. That's hopefully like a helpful specific nugget of where you can push them, knowing that eventually we want to get to a place where natural flavor or any of these proprietary blends, they should be publicly available. I also think the idea around proprietary blends in general is BS. The reason I say that is because whether it's the fragrance blend from Beautycounter's perfumes or from we even list flow agents, which are used to help stuff flow into the actual capsule because making supplements is super hard. Most brands don't list their flow agents and the other ingredients of a supplemental fact panel. All of that information is super important for brands to have. And also you can't necessarily just reverse engineer something. And there's copycats already in the marketplace that are happening. Ritual's entire philosophy from the time it launched was to share not only everything publicly, but also the suppliers we use. And it hasn't impeded our growth. So like this idea that intellectual property must be protected in order for a company to grow, that's just, we've proven that time and time again that that's not the real case.
I love that you're moving it forward and showing the growth in a different area. Okay, the last thing that we want to talk about is efficacy. So I know if I were a brand, I would be wanting to ensure both safety, which we've talked about, and efficacy, right? This idea of both the NSF and the USP labels. The reason that we care whether or not the amount is in the jar that it says is because is our vitamin D level in our blood going to go up when we take the vitamin D supplement, right? And so
Yep.
when we're looking at testing and talking about paths that brands need to be considering, what are the differences between some of the things that can tell us about efficacy? So, for example, clinical research versus clinical trials versus consumer perception. Like, how does that all play into, is this product going to work?
Yep. Great question. So we've got what I describe as a clinically tested problem. I put that in air quotes because that term does need more definition, in my opinion, from the FDA and the FTC, because brands are using it in the supplement space all the time. So first, I'm going to talk about how brands use those terms and some kind of red flags and call outs. And then second, I'll talk about the format. So like how is the actual format impacting the efficacy of the product? So I see this all the time. Brands loosely use the term, this has been clinically studied or clinically studied ingredients, clinically backed. And I would press brands on clearly defining that. So I'm going to give an example of what I see commonly is that a brand will say something is a clinically backed ingredient or clinically studied. People automatically assume that applies to the whole product, right? So that's the first, is there's an assumption, and they may be referring to a specific nutrient or ingredient within that supplement, not the whole formula. So brands need to be really careful about saying if there's a clinical trial on the whole formula, that's the gold standard. Very few brands have that. Our flagship multivitamin at Ritual has a clinical trial on the entire formula. Clinically backed ingredients are also important, and it's a pretty big financial endeavor for brands to get the whole formula. So if they're not there yet, that's okay. But if they're using clinically backed and clinically studied ingredients, that's great. However, stay with me. A lot of brands are using clinically backed ingredients, but they don't use them in the same doses as the clinical study. Okay, so if you know that there's a clinically backed ingredient and a particular nutrient is really effective at 2000 IUDs, but they're using it at 500 in the formula that you're consuming, you can't assume that the clinical backed efficacy is translating to the product that you're consuming. So this is like kind of in the weeds, but it is how when you're shopping and you're seeing stuff and it's like, oh, this sounds really good. This is clinically studied. This is clinically backed. Like, what does that actually mean? Are brands using it at the same doses in the clinical studies? Were those clinical studies conducted in a best-in-class manner? Double-blind placebo? You know, like all of the things, are they, you know, university-led? Have they been peer-reviewed? All of these are like criteria of what makes it for a really good clinical study. And then how do brands talk to consumers about that? So it's great if they have a human clinical trial on their finished formula. They should celebrate that and feel very strong. If they're just using clinically backed ingredients, also great, but they should be able to share with you what those clinical studies are. So I'll get to the action point of this whole story, which is if you're vetting a supplement brand and they use these terms, I would ask them, do you have the clinical studies that you used to help design this product? This should not be confidential information because the clinical study should be publicly available. And then you can look at that clinical study yourself and say, oh, look, they did actually use it at the same doses in the formula I'm purchasing as was in the clinical study.
I will take it one step geekier and say that you can actually type in the name of a brand into PubMed and see how many studies are associated with a particular blend of like that brand being associated with actual clinical trials versus it, you will immediately find out then if they're only referring to an ingredient versus a blend of their own product, right? Because and I also want to reiterate what I heard you say, which is that just because someone hasn't necessarily reviewed a blend doesn't mean it's a bad thing. They could just not have been there yet, or maybe they're a small startup and they haven't had a funding. I'm sure at one point Ritual had great products that are now clinically studied that at one point didn't yet have that because it
Yep.
was, you know, a homegrown up and coming brand. And at the same time, it allows you to read between the kind of, as Audrey says, clinical study washing, right? Like this green washing kind of effect. It is asking us and consumers to play chemist and, you know, to have a PhD in a lot of this, like we had to have for beauty. And at the same time, it is logical to think, oh, this study said 2000 IUDs, but this supplement is only 500 IUDs. It might be that the supplement label is saying you need to take 4 for a proper dosage, and you've only been taking 1 and you haven't had the same results that you were expecting. Like, this all kind of ties in together and can also be related to the quality of the ingredient. And that's something I know you're passionate about at Ritual and ingredient transparency. Not all ingredient sources are the same and efficacy wise. Do you want to speak to that a little bit too?
Yep. I'm also trying to follow the chat a little bit. Yeah. Audrey's point about like the EWG lens for this is where I feel like it's interesting and fun to be in the supplement space because we're kind of like at the beginning. There has to be like another type of consumer app to help with that. Both of those things. Cece, I forgot your question. I'm closing the chat.
Ingredient quality.
Ingredient quality, yeah. So this gets to the second point that I didn't get to, but related to efficacy, which is about the forms and format. So ingredient quality matters significantly. And so there you can actually get better quality or more efficacious nutrients from lab derived or what someone calls synthetically derived ingredients versus their natural counterparts. So let's talk about that for a second. Oftentimes the term synthetic in other consumer categories does mean the like heavy reliance on petrochemicals, not always true for supplements. So a great example of that would be choline, which is an essential nutrient, really important for especially pregnant women and prenatal audience in general. But choline, a lab-derived choline, can be made by actually a chemical reaction of 2 different salts being blended together. And so again, people may have a strong like aversion to, oh, I don't want to have something that's lab made or synthetic made, but the actual potency and quality of that can actually be significantly better. Another example would be in our products, we use a vegan omega that was first harvested once from the ocean from algae, and then it's used basically in perpetuity. There's a biochemical process that is replicated over and over, so it's more sustainable. You're not continuing to harvest algae from the ocean, and it's also highly controlled and has a high level of quality, reduced risk for things like persistent bioaccumulative toxicants that are building up in our oceans, all of these types of things. So the issue of quality and whether or not something is natural or lab derived are kind of go hand in hand. And there's a lot of kind of interesting intersections between safety and sustainability within the industry. With that being said, there are a lot of great natural and botanical ingredients that are also used within the industry. They don't oftentimes have the, you want to make sure that there's clinical evidence around those botanicals or naturally derived ingredients. And again, that the doses are the same because those ingredients have a tendency to degrade quicker than those that are lab or synthetically made. So quality matters because every single time that you purchase a product that you're ingesting or using in your home, it comes from somewhere. And quality often has an intersection of safety and sustainability and human rights concerns that I had talked about previously.
And I think the last one that we'd kind of talked about preparing for, I know we've thrown some extra ones at you, which is kind of what are the best in class standards for some of these efficacies, right? As we look at clinical trial results, some of the things that, for example, on the beauty side, we know that the industry standard is a 30-person evaluation, and then, a short and long-term review process of efficacy. What is the equivalent of legitimizing? I don't know if that's the right word. Legitimate practices for the same kind of thing on the supplement side.
Yep. I think we have an article on Ritual's website that actually like spells out all of these steps. If someone wants to look it up, but I can kind of verbalize it. Randomized, so making sure that the study is randomized is really important. Double blind, there should be a placebo involved. This sounds really small, but like is actually important. We even create placebos when we do our studies at Ritual that look exactly like the product. You think that would be like a common step? It's not. Oftentimes university led, if there's like, we partner with Exeter University, for example, that shows another level of independence for a clinical trial and efficacy. That's very important. There are certain CROs, which are basically like firms for hire to do these clinical studies that can also be helpful. We used one for our skin health supplement, for example. And then I think in what we like to do at Ritual is to have all of those clinicals go on to be published in peer-reviewed journals. So peer-reviewed journals means that other independent scientists have vetted both how the study was set up and how they drew their kind of conclusions about the efficacy of a particular product or ingredient. And then they give it a stamp of independence, a stamp of approval. So those are the kind of different layers and things to look for when you see those words. A brand isn't typically going to use those words when they're describing their clinical study if it's not true. So that would be a very high risk endeavor. So if you're like, oh, but can I even believe if someone's taking the time to write on their product page that something's a randomized placebo-controlled double-blind clinical study, the chances are that it's pretty legit. And then if it's not available publicly on their website, ask them to send it to you and see if it's available for you to take a look at yourself.
Lindsay, I appreciate you taking the time so much. I want to point out, I know you said you'd be willing to do a part two. You have the ability to say whether or not that was real later, but I do want to point people to, you have been on my podcast, The Whole View, several times talking about supplements and other things if people want more information. And you also have your own website at lindsaydahl.com where you've written about, for example, I pulled a link of the double-edged sword of educating people about toxic chemicals and consumer products is something that might be relevant. Are there other things that you want to refer people to maybe follow up for more information?
I think that's a good question. I have not been writing on my website and I should be, but I'm writing a book. So when the book comes out in 7 million years, yeah, it'll all be, well, I've changed the world by then, right? It'll all be moot. No, but I think one thing that I would recommend, and this is not me trying to plug Ritual, because I know many of you are supporting other brands. I've always come to this work from a non-competitive space. So cheering on all the other brands that you all are thinking of working for or work for. But I do think our impact report, selfishly, if you go to ritual.com and you in the top right, it says our standards. You can quickly scroll down and see our 2023 impact report. I think that's a helpful kind of primer on a lot of the problems that I talked about in the industry, because we're talking about problems and solutions, including some of the basics that I opened with of the category growth. There's citations there for you. It's pretty consumer friendly in the way that it's written. So that's like a good kind of starting spot. The journal, which is the nice name for the blog on Ritual's website, is another place. I did a how to shop the supplements aisle guide. That is, again, you can find that on Ritual's journal, which is just like an easy thing to recap some of the things that we talked about, natural versus synthetic, which certifications to look for, all that kind of good stuff. I think are nice guides. And we've got a little bit more time. So if there's other questions too, happy to answer more.
Awesome. I was just going to ask you if you have 15 minutes to answer some questions. So one of the ones that I think we missed was I had asked about FDA recall being mandatory or not. And I'm not sure, did we clearly answer that question?
No, we didn't clearly answer that question. The FDA can do a mandatory recall, and there's been a few instances, but they've been few and far between. So it's good the authority is there, but it's not, I would say it's been more widely used on the food side of things, like we just saw with cinnamon tainted with lead, apple pouches. Like those have been egregious examples where it's like, of course, there's a recall. But in the supplement space, there's only a handful of examples from the last 15, 20 years.
Most of the notices I see are all voluntary.
Yeah.
Companies are like, oh yeah, let's take that off the market and fix it.
Yep.
Okay, well, I don't know if anybody else wants to come off mute and ask questions, or if you want to put them in the chat, but I do want to be respectful of Lindsay's time, so let's keep it at 10 minutes, and then we can do a final wrap.
I have a question. This is Andy Jones. Hi, Lindsay. First of all,
Hi.
thank you so much. This is so helpful and your expertise is so valuable. So I'm just curious, kind of like looking ahead at verifications and where the industry is moving. From your standpoint, do you think that there are like new certifications or labeling things that we could be on the lookout for that'll be coming, or like EWG verification, or like we talked about in the chat, any apps that might be in the works for screening supplements and that kind of thing?
Yeah. Um, there aren't great tools right now when it comes to consumer safety apps. In other product categories, every time that someone has launched one of those, I still feel like they're like flawed. So I've almost kind of like personally evolved my thinking over the years of consumer apps, just having been on the side of like having to explain why something isn't always quite right. Um, so I don't feel like we have great tools yet in the supplement industry. That's part of the reason I did that really simple how to shop the supplement aisle. It is not super comprehensive. But I do think the certifications that we use in that guide are a helpful starting point. So like I saw in the chat, some of the brands you're interested in are non-GMO project verified, which is great. UST organic, if there's a lot of naturally derived or plant-based ingredients, that is also a good one to look for. Note in the supplement industry, there are certain ingredients that brands from an efficacy perspective would want to use that would deem something not USD organic. Our protein powder at Ritual is a great example of that. We wanted to complete the pea protein and we used a particular ingredient. It doesn't have any sort of toxic endpoints, but we couldn't get that certification. So a little bit of a caveat there. And then Clean Label Project, I think, is the other one I mentioned that I think is really helpful to look for, along with USP and NSF.
Thank you.
Lindsay, hi, it's Andrea Ippolito. I was hoping to ask you a little bit of a not a supplement question, but a safety rating question just because of your depth and experience in the industry. And I'm assuming you probably do a deep dive into this for your personal life. Similar to the safety ratings that we're all looking for all these other brands in regards to home goods and furniture, which is actually what my like day job is. Again, with us having the lens and the training of question everything with Beauty Counter, like I definitely come across a lot of these safety ratings, just for obviously the processing and the chemicals used and all that different stuff. Do you have any go-tos that you like to use in that industry?
Yeah. Very broad question. If you have like a one layer deeper, please ask a follow-up. But in home goods, like, are you talking about like cleaners and stuff?
I mean myself, like the I don't know how to say it, the OEKO text.
Okeotech, yeah.
OEKO all the certifications, Made Safe is one that I've seen them
Yep.
use. I'm trying to dig Green Guard certified.
Yep.
Okay. All that stuff. There's Green Guard, there's Gold certified. I mean, all those different things. So, just
yeah.
those.
Almost. So the short answer is everything you just rattled off are legit certifications. Okeotech, Green Guard, EPA Safer Choice, Made Safe. All of those are credible certifications, in my opinion. Again, they're certifying certain things. So like, I think sometimes we want all the things we care about to be like in one certification that doesn't exist. And it is also very expensive for brands to get lots of certifications across different things. But within that space, I do FSC certified is also legit. It's one of the best. I would say that's the gold standard when it comes to anything that is like comes from wood forest. It is like an actual legit forestry certification. The other one I would look for is it's, oh my gosh, now I'm actually blanking if this is a certification or if it's a brand. So I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to give you wrong information. I was going to talk about the like textile woven rug industry, but I need to dust that one off before I share it.
Yeah, I know I didn't come to this. I didn't come to the call with the list too, but yeah, there's a lot that I dig into and a lot of my clients are looking for it. And I want to almost like with the branching off of just being a resource for like, look at these certifications and use this filter when shopping for your brands. This
Yep.
is really helpful to know that you think of those. If for some reason you come across it, if you can, Jen, Indra, or Stacy know how to, they can definitely reach me. I'd love to hear it if you think of it. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I have one other question that came up in the chat, specific to C of A's, certificate of analysis. I can talk about that for a second. I think when brands publicly share their C of A's, that's great. That's like a great form of transparency. And sometimes just things to look for. Just because a brand shares a C of A doesn't mean that they're necessarily asking all the safety questions. You have to look at what was the C of A testing, certificate of analysis. Was it just looking for heavy metals, or do you want it to also give you the test results for microbial micro testing or allergens or whatever? C of A's can be, is a generic term for any sort of test result. So what are they actually testing for? How often are they testing, and how often do they update those kind of results for the public? I think are kind of important questions to ask. Again, knowing as someone who has to like operationalize this from the inside a brand perspective, if a brand has a ton of products, having a C of A for every single product for every single lot or batch made is not going to be realistic. So I think that's a cool ask for companies. It is hard to do for people. And I think in particularly high risk categories, like for protein powder, Ritual publishes the heavy metal test results publicly on our website for that particular category because we know we care about it and we would want to see that level of visibility. And, not all brands necessarily go to that level, but I do think that is definitely gold standard.
I wonder if you have information at the top of your head around cleaning products in terms of what to look for, what to avoid, anything from that perspective.
Yeah, I'm actually a little rusty in this space, if I'm honest with you all. And that's actually a good sign because there's a lot of good market options where I've had to like not be as diligent because the market has really moved forward significantly. 10 years ago, I would have been able to rattle off a lot of them, but I think there's a few things that I would look out for and ask questions about. The most common kind of issues within the industry, again, first is around fragrances. So around fragrance disclosures, that was a good thing to know and press companies to be more transparent about. It is much easier in this space to be transparent than it is for natural flavors, like we had already talked about. It's also where there is a lot of source of different things. Like I have a child with respiratory issues where asthmatic children and sensitive individuals in the home want to be careful about that. The second is around volatile organic compounds, which are VOCs is a generic term used for ingredients that often go hand in hand with something that is a very effective cleaner. So some of the like higher duty, heavy duty cleaners, if sometimes your house can smell for a week. That's usually a pretty big red flag that there are VOCs within that particular cleaner. Probably also made it a highly effective thing to clean your oven or your grout or whatever. The efficacy, there are some trade-offs, although the cleaning space has gotten a lot better over the years. But VOCs are one of the other kind of bigger health risks you want to look out for.
Okay, I think if someone has one more question, but otherwise we'll respect your time. And Lindsay, again, thank you so much for everything today. Melissa just shouted out Scour Off, and I immediately was like, oh, I didn't know you had an asthmatic child. I'm going to send you a care package of clean home products that don't have VOCs because we appreciate your time so much. Was there
Awesome.
any other questions we didn't cover that you wanted to share, Lindsay, or anybody else has?
No, just excited for everyone. There's a lot of industries that need a lot of work, and the supplements industry is no different. So thank you.
A lot of us have been enjoying is feedback from companies that say, you're making us better, right? Like if you're asking questions and they're like, wow, I didn't think consumers were interested in this information, like you're helping us move forward in this space. That has been hugely refreshing and something that we learned because of you and because of the education that we got at Beauty Counter. So thank you so much for making us be incredible, knowledgeable advocates that can move the industry forward, because that is something that Greg and everybody at Beauty Counter wanted, right? Was to put safer products into the hands of everyone. So we can take this information we've been empowered with and move it forward in an industry because of that. And that just, you know, the work that you've done to change 20 laws, like think about it being exponentially beneficial across 50,000 consultants now, holding other brands accountable. So thank
Oh,
you so
I mean,
much.
I love it. You all have so much power right now. And I say this with, as again, someone who receives all the super hard questions for a brand that is doing our best, like a lot of brands, not all are doing. The amount of power you have in the like specificity of questions, I guarantee some people inside some of these companies are like, oh shit, which is good. Like you need them, you need these companies to be asking hard questions, hiring experts that actually know this stuff internally, not just relying on what the kind of common industry practices. And so I have no doubt that all of you are making pretty quick changes within a lot of companies across a lot of different industries. And that's super exciting to me. So here's to taking your power.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And please tell teammates who couldn't get in. I'm so sorry that we underestimated attendance. Lindsay, you're a magnificent draw, and we will get the recording out to everyone shortly. So thanks,
Awesome.
everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.